Thanks to Baron of Dice, Grey Matter Gaming, and Monument Hobbies for sponsoring this video.
Hi, I'm Campbell McLaughlin, and I'm accidentally pretty good at Warhammer 40,000. After nearly a year of 10th edition, Games Workshop is releasing a new missions pack for Warhammer 40,000. Pariah Nexus marks the second season of competitive play for 10th edition, and brings with it an entirely new missions deck, plus a number of major changes to the match play process. There's a ton going on here, and the changes are going to have a massive impact on competitive play for the next year, shaping not just terrain and missions, but also how armies are built and played. As usual, we've got the full rundown of what's in the new rules, what's changed, and what it means for your games of Warhammer 40,000. And, as always, if you prefer to read rather than watch or listen, all of this information is covered in an article on our website, www.goonhammer.com, which we've linked in the doobly-doo. There are two parts to this video. In the first, we'll go over all the basic changes. This is real nuts and bolts stuff, but if you don't know it, the second part won't make any sense. In the second part, we're going to talk about what all this means for your games and how we think these changes will affect competitive play. So if you want to skip ahead to that part, jump to this timestamp. It's probably over here, unless I put it down there. I'll wait. The overview. What you need to know. There are 6 key things you need to know about these new missions. Changes have been made to the play sequence. They made some tweaks to the play sequence that are worth knowing, but not worth spending a ton of time on in this video. Actions are back. Actions now have formal rules associated with them, and they're not just tied to being able to shoot. New mission rules. Mission rules return, and they've received a major overhaul. The biggest change? There's no more chilling rain, so every game you play will have some added effect. About half of these give a bonus to battle line units. The Pariah Nexus deck has completely reshuffled its missions, both primary and secondary. There are some new primary missions, and almost every secondary mission has changed. Some have been replaced, while others have been renamed or tweaked. Gambits are gone. You remember gambits, right? Those things everyone ignored? You can tell me in the comments below that you accomplished a bunch of them, but I won't believe you. Well, gambits are gone now, replaced by a new secret missions mechanic. You still make a choice after round 3, but now you have options which can actually be scored, and all of them have real counterplay. New deployment maps. There are now 6 deployment maps. One of them, Tipping Point, is new, while Sweeping Engagement and Dawn of War have changed. It's a lot, and these changes are going to have a big effect on how the game is played. Even small changes like how scoring is done on the Bring It Down secondary mission can have massive impacts on how players build armies. The game sequence and pregame. A few changes have been made to the game sequence, such as when you redeploy units or what happens when you deploy a Titanic unit. It counts as 2 drops instead of just 1. For the most part, this part of the game will feel the same as before. Actions. As we said earlier, actions are back. We now have formal rules for actions instead of the weird pseudo-action rules we had in Leviathan. Units still need to be able to shoot to perform actions, but now they can't do them if they advanced or fell back, or if they're in engagement range of enemy units. Also, aircraft and OC-0 units can't do actions either. For all you would-be robot jocks out there wondering how you're gonna do actions with your knights, don't worry. Titanic character units can still shoot after they start an action, and they can do actions while locked in combat with other units. We're big fans of this change. Codified actions are a much needed addition to the rules, and these new rules close some silly loopholes. In addition to being used more in secondary missions, actions show up in the primary missions and in mission rules. The biggest change here might be that OC-0 units can't perform actions anymore, making Nurglings suddenly a whole lot worse. Pour one out for those stinky little turd boys. Mission rules. There are 10 mission rules, and they've been massively overhauled from the Leviathan missions pack. The biggest difference is that there's no longer chilling rain, so every game you play will have some add-on effect. You can break these mission rules into 2 groups. Group 1, General Effects. Hidden Supplies is the one returning mission rule from Leviathan. It's the one that gives you an extra objective marker in the middle of the table. Fog of War gives every unit the benefit of cover in the first round, and also players can't use core stratagems except for new orders. Adapt or Die lets players on fixed missions trade out one of their secondary cards once per battle, trading it for another fixed mission. And twice per game lets tactical players draw an extra card when drawing a secondary mission. Then they shuffle one of those two cards back into their deck. Inspired Leadership. As long as your warlord is outside of your deployment zone, then friendly units within 9 inches and visible to it get +1 on their battle shock tests. Smoke and Mirrors. After players deploy, each player can place 1 unit on the battlefield into strategic reserves, bypassing points limits, and that unit can be up to 500 points in a 2,000 point game. Some of these effects are huge. Fog of War making it so players are unable to use smokescreen, grenades, overwatch, or command rerolls in the first turn is a big deal, and knowing you'll have cover on turn 1, even in the open, can impact your deployment. Group 2. Battle Line Effects. There is a second set of 5 mission rules which give benefits to battle line units. Swift Action. Battle line units can perform an action after advancing or falling back. Stalwarts. Battle line units are still eligible to shoot if they perform an action, and can perform an action while within engagement range of enemy units. Rapid Escalation. In the first battle round, players can set up battle line units from strategic reserves in the reinforcement step of their movement phase. They can't be set up in the enemy deployment zone, and the total points value of units you can do this with can't exceed 200 points in a 2,000 point game. Raise Banners. At the end of each player's turn, if a battle line unit from their army is in range of an objective marker they control, the player scores 1 victory point and they can no longer raise a banner on that marker. So this one puts up an additional 5 or 6 secondary points up for grabs, depending on the mission. Prepared Positions. Battle line units can be targeted with Go to Ground and Heroic Intervention for 0 CP. There are a lot of possibilities here. Depending on how these are applied to the mission packs, you can either end up at an event where battle line units are much more powerful, or where it just might not matter that much. We're still waiting on the GW Tournament Companion to give us guidelines for missions using these, but as always, it'll be up to tournament organizers to decide which mission rules they want active at their events. Some TOs were all about chilling rain, and may look for the lowest impact mission rules in this pack, opting for things like Fog of War and Hidden Supplies. The battle line effects here are interesting. In a random environment, you can't count on any one effect coming up, but if you know you're going to be playing in an event where you know the mission rules in advance, you can plan for these specific buffs. Of these battle line effects, Rapid Escalation and Stalwarts are probably the most powerful, but Prepared Positions can make units like Plague Marines and Berserkers really nasty. Deployment Maps. There are now 6 deployment maps in the deck. 3 return unchanged. Dawn of War now has deployment zones which go 12 inches into the battlefield, meaning that they're only now 20 inches apart as opposed to 24. Sweeping Engagement has left its objective markers in the same place, but replaced the diagonal deployment zones with a new stepped deployment zone, which goes out 8 inches and 14 inches on the long table edge. This creates an interesting close zone at the middle of the table where the corners of the 2 deployment zones are only 16 inches apart. Tipping Point offers a hammer and anvil version of the same concept, with stepped deployment zones which are only 20 inches apart in the middle of the table. It otherwise uses the objective positioning from Crucible of Battle. These 3 deployment maps combine with Search and Destroy to give us 4 maps where units can be deployed much closer to each other than 24 inches, with Sweeping Engagement in particular putting players extremely close to the middle of the table. Depending on how often each map shows up, this can push players towards more melee-focused armies capable of pulling off more reliable turn 1 charges. And even if you decide to deploy further back, your opponent will still have that much more early movement to move into staging positions. It's worth mentioning that both of the stepped deployments are kinda bonkers with Hidden Supplies, and we're surprised there isn't a rule about how it works with them. These changes are also good news for big models. Now pretty much any unit you could bring, including things like the Tesseract Vault or Estampa, can now fit in every deployment zone. Primary Missions. There are 9 primary missions in the deck. Take and Hold and Supply Drop are both back in the same form, while Priority Targets, Sites of Power, and Vital Ground are gone entirely. Let's start with the original missions, which have been adjusted. Purge the Foe. Score 4 victory points for hold 1, hold more in the command phase. Score 4 victory points for kill 1, kill more at the end of the turn or round. You no longer score kill more in round 1, so going second doesn't give quite as big an advantage. Scorched Earth. Score 5 VP for each marker, max at 10. Burning an objective is an action and now finishes at the end of the game. Burning just requires control, no 1-inch distance requirement. No cap on victory points for burnt objectives, so you can score up to 25 for burning objectives. Going second has a lot more value here, since you can burn an objective on the final turn and score it before it burns. The Ritual. This is the mission where you can create additional objective markers. Creating an objective is an action and completes at the end of your turn, so you can't cleanse an objective you just made. Markers are now placed exactly 12 inches away from one marker in no man's land, more than 6 inches from any other markers. This makes it a little easier to get your first objectives on the table, as they can be a little further to the sides of the table, though there's still no restriction on how close they can be to a table edge. It also reduces how much you can cluster objectives up, which could previously make durable infantry units that could sprawl across 2 objectives a bit of a nightmare. Unexploded Ordnance. Basically deploy servo skulls in a new, better format. Moving objective markers is an action which completes the end of your turn. No more kicking objectives twice per round. When you move a marker, it can't end up in impassable terrain on top of a model or another objective marker. You score 2, 5, or 8 victory points for being wholly within 12 inches, 6 inches, or inside your opponent's deployment zone. This corrects a major problem with servo skulls, in which objectives moved in both player turns, creating insane blowout wins for the player going first as they kicked objectives across the table. Even worse if they could sticky them, in which case they would just keep kicking themselves. This new version is much more restrained and forces you to seriously reduce your damage output in order to move multiple objectives in a turn. Though it prompted the veterans in our crew to kind of lose their minds at the idea that you'd pick up and move unexploded ordnance around the battlefield. Which, I'm not an army guy, but you don't pick up a bomb and move it. Outside of like Team Fortress 2. Now let's look at the new batch of primary missions. Burden of Trust. A new mission requiring you to hold objectives after controlling them. You score 4 victory points for each objective you control out of your deployment zone. Then you pick one unit in your army on that objective, excluding aircraft, to guard it. At the end of your opponent's turn, you score an extra bonus 2 victory points for each non-battle shocked unit that's still guarding their objective marker. You have to control the objective marker you're guarding. This mission puts more of a premium on durability than most, and gives an advantage to shooting in castle armies over forces who want to sticky their objectives and move on. 2 bonus victory points aren't necessarily enough to hold back a key unit, but still nice to have. Terraform, an action-based mission. The Terraform action is done on an objective marker outside of your deployment zone, which you control. It's done in the shooting phase, and it finishes at the end of your opponent's next turn or the end of the battle. It can also be done by multiple units per turn, but each objective can only be terraformed once. You score 4 victory points for each objective marker you control, and an extra 2 victory points for each objective marker you terraformed during the battle. So if you terraform 3 objectives early on, you'll just keep scoring for those even if you lose control of them. It's important to terraform early and on multiple objectives with durable units, but you'll need to screen or protect them for a full turn. This can give the player going first a big advantage, particularly if they're faster or able to put higher OC units on objectives in spots which are out of line of sight. Linchpin, an interesting mission in which your primary scoring is dependent on holding your home objective. Each round, score 3 victory points for controlling your home objective marker. If you don't control it, you score 3 victory points for each mark you control outside of your deployment zone. If you do control it, you score 5 victory points for each other marker you control. It's one of the oddest missions in the bunch, putting more of a premium on holding your home and just having more of the board. There's no cap on this, so if you have a really good turn 1 and snag 3 objectives uncontested, you can walk away with 18 victory points. This suggests that this can be a really high scoring mission, as most players should be able to score at least 8 points per round. Secondary missions. There are 20 secondary missions in the deck, with some returning favorites, some adjusted, and some brand new. These can be split into 2 categories. Fixed secondary missions. There are now 9 fixed secondary missions in the deck. 2 more than we had in Leviathan, and outside of Assassination, none of them score you more victory points for running tactical missions over fixed. That said, many are now more flexible than before, and cards like Storm Hostile Objective or Bring It Down can be optionally discarded if they're unscorable, making it harder to have completely dead draws in tactical. Kill secondaries. Assassination. Destroy a character to net 4 victory points on fixed or 5 victory points on tactical. It also scores you points if your opponent has no more characters left in their army. Bring It Down. One of the biggest overhauls, Bring It Down now scores each time you destroy an enemy monster or vehicle unit, not model, and scores 2 victory points, plus an additional 2 if the unit had 15 plus total wounds, and another 2 if the unit had 25 plus total wounds. There is no longer a turn cap on this card if you're playing tactical, and if your opponent has no eligible targets when this secondary is drawn, you can discard it, which is another welcome change. This basically means that crisis suits are no longer victory point pinatas, and it's a big boon to Chaos Knights lists where War Dogs now only give up 2 victory points per model. This means that if you want to max that Bring It Down against them, you have to score the full 20 VP. Cull the Horde. Each time you destroy an enemy infantry unit with a starting strength of 20 or more models or 25 or more total wounds, score 5 victory points. Note that attached leader units are ignored for this math. This more resembles the old 9th edition version of No Prisoners, though actually finding units which give up points for this may be difficult. Like Bring It Down, this secondary objective isn't capped per turn, and also like Bring It Down, you can get rid of it if there's no valid targets. Action secondaries. Cleanse. Scores 2 victory points if you perform the cleanse action on one objective marker outside of your deployment zone. 4 victory points if you cleanse 2. Note that each unit now cleanses a single objective marker, so you can't double up on this with one large unit. Establish Locus. This is the reskinned version of Deploy Teleport homers, giving you an action that one unit from your army can do if it's either within your opponent's deployment zone or 6 inches of the center of the battlefield. Complete the objective and it's worth 2 victory points if you're within 6 of the center and 4 if you're in the opponent's deployment zone. Recover Assets. One of the new secondary missions, Recover Assets lets 2 or more units from your army do an action if they're wholly within different zones of the battlefield. Your deployment zone, no man's land, and your opponent's deployment zone. The action finishes at the end of your opponent's next turn or at the end of the game. Complete this action in 2 zones for 3 victory points or in 3 zones for 6 victory points. Positional and board control secondaries. Behind enemy lines. At the end of your turn, you score 3 victory points if you have 1 non-aircraft unit wholly within your opponent's deployment zone, and 4 if you have 2 or more non-aircraft units. Mercifully, you can now choose to reshuffle this if you draw it on turn 1. Also, there's no more bonus for scoring this in tactical mode. Engage on all fronts. At the end of your turn, score 2 victory points if 1 or more non-aircraft units from your army are wholly within 3 different table quarters and more than 6 inches from the center of the battlefield, or 4 victory points if you have units in all 4 quarters and more than 6 inches from the center. This is much easier to work with than the old version of this mission, so you no longer have to be more than 3 inches into a table quarter to score it. Storm Hostile Objective. Storm Hostile gives you 4 victory points for controlling a marker your opponent held at the start of the turn, or 4 victory points if you control 1 or more markers and your opponent started the turn not holding any. As a subtle change, reshuffling this when you draw at turn 1 is now optional, so if you're going second or your opponent has put infiltrators out on no man's land objectives, it can be a great early draw. Tactical missions. The remaining tactical set are a mix of new and old options. Capture enemy outpost, attempting target, and investigate signals are gone, while some others have been adjusted. Generating missions. If you're playing tactical objectives, you can use the new order stratagem more than once per battle. This is a big help to tactical players who are less likely to get stuck with bad secondary missions. A number of secondary missions also now allow a player to discard or reshuffle them if they cannot be scored. Board control and positional secondaries. Area denial has been fixed, adjusted from its original insane wording. Now you score 2 victory points at the end of your turn if you have 1 or more non-aircraft units within 3 inches of the center of the battlefield, while there are no enemy units within 3, or 5 victory points if you're within 3 inches and there are no enemy units within 6. Extend battle lines is also back, scoring you 5 victory points if you control an objective in your deployment zone and 1 in no man's land, or just 2 if you only have 1 unit left and control 1 in no man's land. Secure No Man's Land is back too, scoring you 2 victory points for controlling an objective marker in No Man's Land, or 5 for controlling 2 or more. Defend Stronghold is unchanged, and it still stinks. It also can't be drawn in the game's first turn. Kill Secondaries. No Prisoners is back, scoring you 2 victory points for each enemy unit destroyed this turn, up to 5 victory points max. Overwhelming Force scores you 3 victory points for each enemy unit you kill that started the turn within range of an objective marker, up to a max of 5. March for Death has your opponent pick 3 of their units in the battlefield when it's drawn. At the end of either player's turn, if 1 or more of those units has been destroyed or removed from the battlefield for any reason, you score 5 victory points. Think of it like a tempting target, but for dudes. Action Secondaries. Sabotage is a new action-based secondary. In the shooting phase, one of your units outside of your deployment zone can start this action, which finishes at the end of your opponent's next turn or the end of the battle. Complete the action in No Man's Land for 3 victory points, or in your opponent's deployment zone for 6 victory points. Containment is a new action-based secondary. In your shooting phase, 1 or more units from your army can do this action while it's wholly within 9 inches of a battlefield edge and outside your deployment zone. Each one has to be near a different edge. This one completes immediately, and you score 3 victory points for each edge contained to a max of 6. Note that on some deployment maps, it's possible to still hit your own battlefield edge. On the whole, fixed secondaries have become better, and there are more options to choose from. While Bring It Down is no longer the slam dunk it used to be, it's still plenty valuable if your opponent is skewing heavily into vehicles, and it's still likely to be the right choice against knight armies. Established Locus is the biggest factor here. Only scoring 2 victory points in the middle weakens it as a pick, meaning there's no longer an easy path to 15 victory points with it, and it may be that Recover Assets replaces it as a pick for armies which can easily drop a unit into the enemy deployment zone late in the game. Getting 3 VP per turn with Recover Assets feels pretty easy, and getting 1 6-turn drop will give you 18 victory points. Many secondary missions feel easier to score now, such as Engage in All Fronts, though they tend to be worth fewer VP, topping out at 4 and offering no bonus points to players in tactical missions. This, combined with the new ability to use new orders more than once per battle, and the ability to discard more secondaries when they're dead draws, makes going tactical much less risky. While the armies which were already best at fixed may find a few new strategies, clearing that bar may be more difficult, and so players may just not bother if they can score more reliably in tactical. Secret Missions. Gambits were terrible, and I'm not convinced they weren't bad as a joke. In their place, we now have Secret Missions. Secret Missions are much more of an underdog mechanic, designed to give a player a way to catch up. Here's how they work. At the end of Battle Round 3, starting with the player who had the second turn, if your primary VP is less than or equal to your opponent's, you could do a secret mission. If you do, pick one of the secret mission cards and hold on to it face down. Your victory points from the primary mission are now capped at 20. At the end of the battle, you reveal your secret mission, and if you achieved it, you score the listed 20 victory points. This means your primary scoring for the game is now capped at 40, and your max score is 90. There are 4 secret missions. Command Insertion. Have your warlord in range of 1 or more objective markers in your opponent's deployment zone that you control. Shatter Cohesion. Your opponent has no units in the battlefield, or if they do, those units are either battle-shocked, below half strength, or more than 3 inches away from all objective markers. Unbroken Wall. You control 3 or more objective markers not within your deployment zone. War of Attrition. 1 or more battle line units from your army is in your opponent's deployment zone, and they have no battle line units on the battlefield, or if they do, they're all within, not wholly within, their deployment zone. As a sharp contrast to Gambits, these feel realistically scoreable in a number of games, though the challenge will be bluffing your opponent or stopping them from realizing which one you've taken. Though note that if someone takes a secret mission, you will know they have one. They can hide which one, but not that they have one to begin with. What does all this mean for competitive play? There are a ton of changes here. It's not always obvious how they're going to change competitive play. Often very small changes can have huge impacts on how armies are built. Here are some of the things we think will shift as a result of these missions. A greater emphasis on melee armies. With 4 deployment maps now offering short distances between deployment zones, the stage is set for fast melee armies to set up for easy turn 1 and turn 2 charges. This is one of those areas where a little bit goes a long way. More vehicles. It's a good time to be a Knights, Crisis Suits, or Soulforged Warp Pack player. The change to Bring It Down really tamps down the amount of scoring you can do off vehicle units, particularly smaller units with fewer than 15 wounds. This is great news for retaliation cadre lists, but also a big boost to armies running heavy on vehicles or transports and knights lists. While I still think you can take Bring It Down against a Chaos Knights army, having to kill 10 War Dogs to maximize Bring It Down instead of 7 is a big deal, and it gives the Knights player a lot more counterplay. A shift towards fixed objectives. There's a bit less reason to take tactical objectives over fixed now, particularly if you can build effectively for fixed. That said, the kill secondaries are much harder to score now, so fixed armies are likely to continue to focus even more on behind enemy lines and established locus. We'll likely see top players using fixed more often and just building for those secondary objectives, though building an army that's good at fixed will be a little bit tougher. Fewer dead draws in tactical. On the other hand, if you are sticking with tactical, there are some upsides. You can now use new orders more than once per game, and more of the secondary missions can now be discarded if they can't be scored, making tactical much more forgiving. Anyone who's ever had a 3-card dead draw turn, me, has to be excited about this change, and if tactical becomes less luck reliant, it might balance out the scoring changes. More battle line. This is a bit of a weird one because it'll depend heavily on which mission rules are going to be in use. For events where multiple rounds use mission rules which benefit battle line units, you'll see more of them being used. That's a boost to armies with great battle line units such as Orcs, Death Guard, and Chaos Space Marines. Slightly less need to stay home. With capture enemy outposts out of the mix, leaving your home objective is much safer, particularly on the missions which don't let you score off your home objective. While it'll still be important to keep an opponent from using an empty deployment zone or home objective for their own scoring, you don't have to worry nearly as much about someone drawing into a surprise 8 victory points if you leave your objective undefended. The action economy is more important. 4 of the primary missions have actions associated with them, as well as 5 secondary missions, making actions a much bigger part of the game. If you're on tactical, that can mean needing to do 3 or 4 actions in a single turn, and that can put a big strain on more elite armies. As you build your army, think about how you'll do actions, who will do them, and what you'll do if those units die. An emphasis on cheap action units. As OC0 units get dropped, it'll be in favor of other cheap OC1 action units. With more action secondaries and primaries than before, these units are more important than ever, though without Investigate signals, the need for them to have Deep Strike is much lower. Depending on the mission, you'll likely want these to be battle line units, and ideally they'll still have good base movement, or scouts, because you can't advance and do an action most of the time. So being able to reach midfield positions without advancing is important. Warp Spiders do, of course, stay winning. The elf malarkey is never ending. The death of OC0 units. Outside of some units like Wolfen, which have other uses, we're likely to see a sharp reduction in usage for OC0 units like Nurglings. While they still have some utility, being unable to do actions really kills their value as a unit. Secret missions will see play. Unlike Gambits, people will actually use secret missions. They're much more reasonable in terms of what they're asking, and because they still cap your total VP at 90, they feel less like something which can turn around a nasty blowout, and more like a way to win a game where you fell behind early, but ended up crushing your opponent. Of the 4 secret missions, the most scoreable feels like Unbroken Wall in games where you're going second, especially on maps running the Hidden Supplies mission rule. Stealing objectives at the end of the game can be pretty easy, though most of the time, if you're in a position to hold 3 in no man's land at the end of turn 5, you're already in position to score 10 or more victory points in the final turn, so scoring 20 won't necessarily be a big deal. War of Attrition may be the most interesting here, because it can be a slam dunk against armies with no battle line units, but still requires making it into their deployment zone. But unless that one's a near freebie, we're just always going to assume our opponent is aiming for the wall. Final thoughts. There's a ton going on in Pariah Nexus, and even small changes can have big ramifications. When you combine this with 2 new codices coming out on the same day, we're due for a huge shakeup. That said, we do still expect melee armies to eat well in this new format, and it'll be interesting to see how the Pariah Nexus Tournament Companion combines these into different mission, rule, and deployment groupings. It's a brave new world for competitive play, and you can expect we'll keep covering it each and every week in our competitive innovation series and updating our faction guides accordingly. Alright, that's enough talking out of me. We covered a lot of stuff today. And again, if you don't want to jump back into a timestamp, all the information in here is also covered in a companion article on Goonhammer.com, which is linked in the description below. Also linked in the description below is our Patreon, which for just a few bucks a month gives you access to extended features on our Tabletop Battles app, which itself is free on the app store of your choice, and will have all of the rules content covered in this video live the day they release. In addition, patrons get early tickets to Goonhammer events and early access to video content like this, so check it out. Lastly, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Baron of Dice, Monument Hobbies, and Grey Matter Gaming. Thanks for watching, and good luck in the new season. Also linked in the description below is our Patreon, which for just a few bucks a month gives you access to expanded features in our Tabletop Battles app, which itself is free on the app. My voice cracked, like a fucking teenager.